Hello and welcome. I'm John Carr. I'm co-director of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life at Georgetown University. I thank you for joining us. This is a really important and timely topic, overcoming poverty as a moral imperative and a national priority towards a better kind of politics. You're interested in this, but so are a lot of other people. When we cut off RSVPs, we had more than 1,800 folks. So I, for one, excuse me for this, I'm really tired of ecclesial politics, GOP politics, who's up, who's down in the White House. It's all important at some level. I'm really excited to be talking substance. This is not about who's ahead and who's left behind in Washington. This is about who gets left behind in our country in this pandemic. We're delighted to have with us the presidents of the American Enterprise Institute and the National Urban League, the dean of the McCourt School, our colleague, and somebody on the front lines in California, and I'll introduce them in a minute. But you know the numbers. 1 out of 7 Americans are poor in the richest nation on earth. 1 out of 5 children, twice as many African American and Latino children. Well, that was getting better because of the safety net and a growing economy, and then the pandemic hit. And we not only lost progress, but everything was exacerbated, and we know the realities. Life expectancy is down more for Latino and African American neighbors than the rest of us. I'm always struck when we do one of these that, you say how terrible it is we have to work from home. Some days I sort of like it. But I always remind myself, some people have no work and other people have no home. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And a lot of kids have no quiet place where they can do virtual school. So we're going to talk about who's left behind. One of the things that's exciting about this, not only are we supported, co-sponsored by the McCourt School, this is also supported by the Democracy Fund and the Rockefeller Foundation, but we're a part of a consortium of Catholic institutions that are focused on Pope Francis' message of Fratelli Tutti, a better kind of politics. And Pope Francis said that the moral measure of a society is how we treat the poorest, people who have nothing but their poverty. And so that's what we're going to talk about. I think we're failing that test. And I want to ask each of our colleagues here a fairly simple, profound question to begin with. What is the one thing we ought to know about poverty in the United States? And what is the one thing we ought to pay attention to in terms of public policy? And let me begin with Maria. Maria is the dean of the McCourt School. She is also one of the preeminent researchers, ran the Institute on Poverty Research in Wisconsin. She served in government. Maria, what is the one thing people ought to know about poverty, and what is the one thing we ought to be paying attention to?
Well, thank you, John, and thanks for including me in this conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. I would say the one thing that we should know is that kids are our future, and our failure to invest in them today will lead to our reaping many negative things in the future. I would just cite one of my favorite quotations from Frederick Douglass. It's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. I would note that the same thing goes for women as for men. And not only is it easier, it is less expensive.
The new skill in Washington, unmute. Lorena, you are in California. You're not an East Coast person, but you are on the front lines, working with Faith in Action. You've been an organizer for 20 years. You've worked for the Archdiocese there. What is the one thing we ought to know, and what is the one thing we ought to pay attention to?
I think that we are in a moment right now that will define us definitely as a nation, but also as a people and as a person. So when we're thinking about what this question about what there is to do, what the right thing there is to do, I think we need to actually ask, who do we want to become? That is the central question right now. It's like, who do we want to become as a nation? Who do we want to become as a people? And who do we want to become as a person in the face of a global pandemic? And this question about the measurement of a nation is how we treat the poor, those who have nothing but their poverty. I love Pope Francis, but I would say the poor have so much more than their poverty. And my life and work and my family's life work has been to actually lift up that knowledge and the protagonism of the way in which the people who are in poverty actually know how to define the problems, and they also know how to define the solutions. So my invitation for right now is really, when we are thinking about who we want to become as a nation, is really to learn to listen to those who are directly impacted by what's happening right now.
Robert, you've been working on this all your life at the state level, local level, now Washington, now at a major think tank. What should we know and what should we be paying attention to?
Well, I was inspired by the question you sent me in advance about why should we dedicate ourselves to reducing poverty in America? And I thought about that, and I reminded myself that the reason I've dedicated myself to that is because I want us to have everyone in America to lead positive and flourishing lives where they can contribute to their families and their communities in a positive way. And I think that we need to constantly recognize that everyone has dignity and everyone has potential. And we should celebrate the first and maximize the second. And I stress that a little bit because I think sometimes we focus only on material resources, money and income. But reducing poverty in America is going to be about a lot more than that, to help the people in New York City or around the country who struggle these days. So I want to start with first principles. Why should we do this? We want people to have flourishing and positive lives, and we want to maximize their potential and celebrate their dignity. John, you got to unmute.
Folks, I tell everybody when we start this, you got to learn how to mute and unmute yourself, and don't put your notes in front of the camera. So I am the poster child of how not to do this. I wasn't part of the question. What do you know? One of the things you ought to know is don't put your notes in front of the camera and unmute yourself. How powerful was that? I mean, flourishing lives, the poor have more than their poverty, and invest in kids now because we'll pay later. Let me turn to each of you in turn. Lorena, two things. One, you are on the front lines. Faith in Action is all across our country, actually around the world, trying to put faith in action and working directly with folks every day. You work for the Archdiocese. You're raising a family. You face adversity yourself. Help us understand the realities. When we say 1 out of 7, 1 out of 5, what does that mean in people's lives? You're trying to help people keep their homes. I read online, you're part of an effort to protect seniors, Asians in particular. You're passing out food in the middle of a pandemic that has made everything worse. So my first question to you, based on your work, your own experience, what does it mean that so many folks are left behind in the richest nation on earth?
So I live in San Francisco, California. San Francisco is one of the richest cities in the world. You will think that with what we have here, we could figure this out. The reality is that, again, the problems that we were facing here in terms of the deep inequity just got exacerbated. The fact that we're looking at this pandemic and that made all the jobs, all the service industry jobs disappear from, overnight, as if it's something that has to do with individuals and people have to somehow apply for benefits or something like that, when in reality it's a natural disaster. San Francisco is a place where, any day we could have an earthquake and the same thing would happen. It makes me wonder if we actually have a plan to actually take care of people. What we have seen is I myself help people from the community complete applications for the very small amount of money there was for rental subsidies. So I talked to about 450 people, just one-on-one, filling out the application. And just to give you an idea, people were making $4,000 or $5,000 a month working in restaurants, taking care of kids, cleaning, janitors, whatever. All those jobs disappeared by mid-March. So when I was asking them, how much did you make in April? 0. How much did you make? How much did you make in May? 0. So basically people went from being able to take care of their family, both people working, doing everything that they're supposed to do if they're able-bodied, to not having anything. They depleted their savings, if they had any, within 2 months. The rents here are very expensive. So people are in debt, very deeply in debt. And now it's not only the fact that people don't have a job, but also it's really hard to go find a job because our kids are at home because homes became school. And because we're in debt, we're at risk of losing our homes. So it's not just losing your shelter, but losing the school for your kids. So people are losing their minds over this. And I think that we need to look at this global pandemic as what it is, which is a natural disaster. And that's the challenge right now, is hurting people's hearts.
Thank you for that. You're an organizer. You've worked with Justice for Janitors, you work with the Archdiocese, now you work with Faith in Action, but you're also a believer. You work for the church, you're active in your parish. I think you actually met with Pope Francis. In one way, this is a religious challenge. Faith in Action is, in some ways, Catholic social teaching in action. It's about human dignity. It's about the priority for the poor. It's about solidarity and subsidiarity. How does your faith shape your response? And did you have a chance to talk to the Pope about this? How does he inspire your work? How did he have any advice for you?
I love Pope Francis. I'm from Paraguay, which is right next to Argentina, and my mom is from Argentina. So to have a Pope that's from Argentina and sounds, when he speaks Spanish, which is his language, he sounds just like my mom. He sounds just like my grandpa and like me. And yeah, I did get a chance to meet him in Rome when we were at the Encuentro Mundial de Movimientos Populares. It's a global encounter of popular movements. And we spent 3 days with people from all over the world talking about this same issue. And we talked to Pope Francis and we asked him what was his advice for us, for the folks that are trying to do this back at home in the United States. And he said, quédate con el pueblo. That means stay close to the people. And he said, they will teach you and they will not lead you astray. And that's exactly the work that we're doing, is staying with the people, not philosophizing about it, not making policy about them without them, but actually keeping people very closely involved, because they know the solutions for their pain, but they need that space to speak about it. So that's the work that we do. And that was Pope Francis' advice. And frankly, that's the work of our church. And it's been beautiful to be able to have hold that space so people can, even though they have no work, even though they're in desperation constantly, to be able to play a role in coming up with some local solutions. That's how our food program came about. It wasn't because somebody gave us a grant. It was actually, we used leftover foods from other food banks and decided just to put it in bags and give it to people. Now we have around 800 people that come. And yeah, we found grants now. But it came out of the idea of people themselves who are all unemployed. And it's run by people who have nothing. But how much joy there is in being able to be a protagonist in healing your own community. So it takes both. And I think it's a dialectical relationship that as a government, as policy folks, we need to get better at, because people have the capacity to change that. And that's what Pope Francis said. I think he said it in Spanish. That sounds like mine, so it's nice.
What a great story. It takes, one of the great things about our initiative is we have a variety of perspectives, and what Lorena is doing in California, staying close to the people. The initiative knows Maria Cancian as a colleague at Georgetown. She's dean of the McCourt School of Public Policy. That's a big deal. It's a huge part of Georgetown, a really important part of our community. She is also one of the preeminent researchers on poverty in our country, especially families in poverty. She has worked in the federal government and HHS, the Administration for Children and Families. She's been elected to be the leader of public officials working in that area. Maria, help us understand the dimensions of this. I mean, you've been studying this all your life. You've been teaching it. You've been advising every level of government. What are the dimensions of this problem, and how is it changing in front of us? And then I want to ask you about some of the proposals that have been offered in the middle of this pandemic and beyond. So what are the dimensions of poverty in the richest nation on earth?
Well, first, I'd just like to kind of reiterate what Lorena said about, people working together within their communities to solve problems, and listening to the communities that are affected and their reality. I think one of the challenges is that government is the way that we work as a collective to create the context within which communities and individuals exist and try to thrive, and the challenges that they face. And I think one of the things that COVID has demonstrated is that we have really cut too many corners as a collective. One of the lessons I think we've learned and are learning from the COVID crisis is that our lack of investments in public health, in childcare infrastructure, in basic supports for families have left us vulnerable to truly catastrophic outcomes. Some of the things that Lorena is seeing in her frontline work. Over the last 25 years, we have built a system that focuses more on encouraging personal responsibility and enforcing work than it does in supporting parents' ability to care for their children. And our work-based safety net has helped some families survive by combining low-wage employment with programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit. But I think two things have become really starkly clear in this COVID context. First, low-wage work does not translate into middle-class life for many workers. People are stuck in dead-end jobs, often with unstable hours, with benefits that are not family supporting, that make them vulnerable when things happen, like COVID, but also an illness in the family, or a car accident, or a child who's sick, or any number of other things. And our work-based safety net leaves those who cannot work, whether that's because of a health or a family obligation or limited marketable skills or things falling apart because of COVID, vulnerable to really deep poverty. So we have put ourselves as a collective in a situation where we from my perspective, are inexcusably vulnerable and have made our children inexcusably vulnerable to the things that can happen. COVID's just made that clearer.
Let me build off that and say, in the middle of the pandemic, the Senate, the House passed a proposal on a party line vote Friday night. And within that are some major steps of a different kind in terms of the how the child credit works, how the EITC works, the refundability. And now Senator Romney has a proposal as well. And others have different proposals, Senator Cotton, Senator Rubio, and others. This seems like a different kind of debate than we've had. All of us have been working for a long time on these issues, and frankly, working to build a child tax credit and an EITC that helps some, but this seems of a different order. Can you tell us what are the choices? What are the decisions? What's the debate we're facing now?
John, I think in my view, there are two things that we need to do. We need to respond to the current COVID crisis, but we also need to address the inadequacies of our systems that were highlighted by this crisis. So we need to invest in putting ourselves in a stronger and better future. I think the immediate crisis requires extending unemployment insurance and food stamps or SNAP benefits. It requires fiscal relief for states and municipalities. It requires support for schools to make up for the enormous losses that have particularly been felt by our most vulnerable students. So all of those things are required, and those are in the bill. But I think perhaps even more important is exactly what you've highlighted, which are kind of changes to the child tax credit that begin to put us in better company, because we are one of the few advanced rich countries that don't have that kind of basic support for children in a lot of contexts. So the current child tax credit is currently not fully refundable. And that's usually when people stop listening. You talk about tax policy and fully refundable or not fully refundable, and it starts sounding technical. But basically what that translates into, and it actually beautifully illustrated by a report that Robert's Center recently published, is that families at the very bottom, those parents who most would be able to benefit from something like the child tax credit, don't receive the full amount of the credit, because at a certain point, if you don't have earnings, you can't get that payment. And so what that means is that fully almost half of children of color are in families that don't receive the full benefit. So what the current proposals would do is they would increase the tax credit from $2,000 to $3,000. They would actually increase it to $3,600 for children who are under 6. And they would have the impact of cutting the number of children in poverty somewhere between a third, I think, is what Robert's estimate suggests, maybe 30%, to 40, a little more than 40% from my colleagues at Columbia University. And so it would have a big impact on poverty, and it would help the most vulnerable children and those whose parents have jobs with fluctuating hours, without sick leave and other protections, and disproportionately children of color. It also provides kind of a minimum safety net for children that is kind of a basic investment, I would argue, in both their and in our future. And I would just say, maybe anticipating concerns that some people might have, that I completely agree that we need to preserve work incentives, but I really believe that we should be focused on doing that by making work more attractive and more manageable. So with a higher minimum wage, with sick leave, and not by holding kids hostage. It is simply unacceptable that we're willing to let 1 in 10 kids go hungry to create an incentive for their parents to work. Even if we had affordable childcare and family supporting jobs available to make going to work a reasonable choice for all those parents, and we do not have that.
Okay. I suspect one of those friends who might have a different view might be Robert. I got to know Robert when he came to Washington about 7 years ago to work on these issues at the American Enterprise Institute, which I think people know is, I think, the leading conservative think tank in Washington. And his work was so impressive, they made him president of AEI. In some ways, I think the most remarkable work Robert has done is not running a big think tank, but trying to administer these programs at the state and local level, New York State, New York City. He has been one of those people who builds bridges, makes alliances, and tells the truth from his own perspective. I would ask, based on all that, first of all, I should remind people, one of the most visible things the initiative ever did, we're not new to the poverty debate, was we had Robert's predecessor, Arthur Brooks, on a major panel on poverty with a couple other people, Robert Putnam from Harvard and President Barack Obama. And presidents don't normally do panels, but President Obama did one on poverty because of the urgency of this challenge. So Robert runs a major institution. He's a substantial, significant voice in the conservative movement. I hope he has a lot of influence in the Republican Party, but you've also been on the front lines of running these things. What have you learned in those experiences which ought to inform this debate?
Well, you're right, John. The most significant work I've ever done was in New York State and New York City, working to lead the large social service agencies there. And I love that work, and I love the progress we made in both the state and the city over the period of time from 1995 to 2013, when I left working for the city to come to AEI. And I think that progress was because we were able to help people move into employment and connect them to various benefits that are provided by government and by others to make their total resources available to them and to their children higher than they had been in the past, when they were relying exclusively on benefits, and higher than they would have been if they were relying only on work. And that was successful. We've talked about challenges and problems and numbers, but the numbers of children in poverty were much worse in the early 90s than they are now. They were worse before 2019, when the combination of work and benefits, which was in place, led to the lowest child poverty rates on record. So we do know how to make progress here. And I think that what the pandemic has challenged us, and I've been through serious crises and emergencies too. I was the commissioner in New York State during 9/11, and I was the commissioner in New York City during Superstorm Sandy. And I think we have to immediately address the needs of people that have been put at risk and are facing terrible hardship during this difficult time. And I think we have, as a country, done a lot of that. And I think the studies that will show is that a lot of income and support has flown in through acts of Congress, both in last fall and last summer, but also ones that are about to take place. But I think we need to be very careful about making significant changes to the way we provide aid to people who struggle that might have unintended consequences. And the two unintended consequences I'm most concerned about concerning this reintroduction of a monthly benefit to households with children, regardless of whether they work, is that people will work less and lose what they had gained in earnings and not make it up in what they're getting in benefits. That could happen. And secondly, they lose the connection that comes with employment, the connection that comes with interacting with other people, the example they set for their children, the human connectiveness that takes place there. And I think we ought to be very careful going back to a pre-welfare reform period where we provide, as a matter of right, a minimum amount of cash assistance that might lead to people working less. The other thing that it might lead to, and again, there are some concerns here that we have to be careful about, is it could lead to more families being formed without the benefit of the second parent. And there is certainly less connection to the other parent through this way of delivering benefits than the one that we have now. So I worked in the child support program. My job was, when I first went into government, was to help get the absent parent connected to the other family, both financially and emotionally. And we made progress there as well. But this program, with this federal benefit flowing from Washington, no intermediary in between, direct cash benefit on a monthly basis to people regardless of whether they work or look for work or engage in training, I think could have some unintended consequences that will accrue negatively to low-income households. And I'm concerned about that. And I think that in this rush to do something, we haven't really thought it through. Politically, it's going to be done in an expedited fashion without, I think, really serious consideration. And I hope it succeeds. I would like it to succeed. But I will tell you, I've watched poverty numbers in the United States for 25 years. I know when they go down, I know when they remain flat, and I know when they go up. And they go up when people work less. And I think we ought to be and they go up when more households are headed by single parent families. And I think we ought to be very concerned about that, not to save money, not because we want to impose our values, but because I've lived in cities where there were high proportions of non-working single parents, and those cities struggled, and we don't want to go back to that.
I bet we're going to have some more conversation about this.
Sure, you've got me here all by myself here. That's good.
Overcoming poverty can't be a partisan or ideological fight. That's one thing we know. And one of the things you have done effectively is challenge your own side. One of the lines I remember you saying, I'm going to read it here, is conservatives still quote President Reagan saying, "We fought a war on poverty and poverty won," are wrong. How do we build enough sense of priority for the poor that this cuts across ideological partisan boundaries in a country and a capital that is completely polarized? My own hope is this is one thing we could get together on. But if it is, it's going to be because people in the Republican Party and the conservative movement pay attention to your message. How do you make the case Well,
I make the case based on the celebrating the human dignity of everyone and the human potential of everyone. And I make the case based on the record, which National Academy of Science has shown, the Columbia Poverty Researchers have shown, we have had an extended period of pretty steady declines in child poverty, properly measured. And the question is, okay, we've had this progress. We want to be careful that we take that progress into account when we make additional steps to do even better. So I think that's one way that I make the case. I think it's important to also, the other side of that quote is conservatives are wrong when they quote Reagan, but liberals are wrong when they say we haven't made any progress and that we're still as bad and as shameful as a country as we were in the 1960s or 1970s. And that's not true either. So I think that to me, it's really about proper measurement of poverty, the extent to which people are in employment, the extent to which children are progressing upward. I do acknowledge with Maria that while we've made some progress on reducing poverty, upward mobility is another issue. And I think we need to do a lot better job there. But I don't think it's a sure thing that providing $600 additional from the federal government in a monthly transfer payment into every household with children, regardless of whether they work or what their circumstances, without any interaction of a caseworker. Remember, I'm a social services worker in a local office. I know what it's like to have people come see you, talk to them, find out what their circumstances. This has been discredited by both the left and the right as kind of a hassle, those pesky social workers. But the fact of the matter is, what we're turning to now is a federal takeover of direct benefits into households with no human interaction. And I'm very concerned about that. I don't think that is the best way to serve struggling Americans.
I see Mark Morial on my screen, and before I call on Mark, I want to offer Maria and Lorena a chance to respond. Right. We've heard from each other. Lorena first.
I really appreciate hearing your perspective, Robert, around this. It's interesting because I am a single parent. My husband died when my child was 3 of cancer, and I became the only working adult that had to sustain my aging parents and my child at that point. And it was terrible, this concept of work as defined by the system. And I love the fact that we talk about being bridge builders. I think that we need to be the kind of bridges that is wide and strong enough to sustain all of us and really see reality as it is. And that might also come with redefining what work is. Because when you're a parent or you have aging parents and you are the person taking care of them, I tell you, you work. You don't work in the workplace. Unfortunately, I had to make the sacrifice to go out into the workplace so that I could pay for rent, pay for the debt that the hospital bills left, and pay for childcare for my child, instead of being there to take care of my own child after the traumatic death of my husband. And this is not just my story. This is the story of so many people, so many people. And I personally think that having people be able to count on some money coming in gives you some peace of mind. That doesn't, and I also hear the fact that we do need that connection to society and be able to connect to new resources and all that. But this question about what work is and how it is defined by what happened in 1996 with Clinton, like, I think you're missing a lot of what we do as folks in the bottom. So yeah.
Maria, a quick comment before I turn to and welcome Mark to our conversation.
I guess my quick comment would just be to remember that back when we had AFDC, we had a program that provided people not with money, regardless of what they were doing, but with support that when they went out and got a job, pretty much every dollar that they earned, we took away some of the support that we were providing them. And a lot of the child support that they might bring in, if the father paid child support, the mom lost some of her welfare. And so what this child tax credit proposal would do, what a child benefit would do is very different. Would provide people with a benefit that they could keep working, and this would be additional income. And we wouldn't begin to reduce the value of the child tax credit until parents are at a high enough income that it would really be relatively irrelevant to their decision making. So I agree with Robert about his critique about the old world, but I disagree that the current proposal is going back to that world.
Yeah, I would just say that Maria's got a very good point there, but there is an income effect with additional benefits as well that could lead to different behavior with regard to work, and it concerns me.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm gonna, Mark, welcome to a very lively conversation. We're delighted you're with us. For people who don't know you, Mark Marial is the president and CEO of one of the oldest, most important civil rights organizations, the National Urban League, that focuses on economic empowerment. If you don't pay attention to the National Urban League, you should. You ought to read The State of Black America every year. And before that, he was a popular and effective mayor of New Orleans. Usually you're popular or effective. You seem to have been both. And you were president or chair of the National Association of Mayors, U.S. Conference of Mayors. I should add, we're very proud. You're an alum of the Georgetown Law School and a product of Catholic education. And you have been a voice to, before the country focused on racial justice in a new way, you were making this case day after day after day. And so my questions for you is, first of all, I asked everybody at the beginning, why should overcoming poverty be a priority? What is the one thing we ought to know? And what is the one thing we ought to do?
So thank you for having me. It's great to be with everyone. why should poverty be a priority? One, it's fundamentally grounded in values. If you embrace, as I do, the teachings of the New Testament, and you embrace the teachings, the addressing, overcoming, confronting poverty, I think is rooted in one of the fundamental teachings of the New Testament. Number two, what we have in the United States is an extraordinary nation and society when it comes to our wealth or output. We have an economy that is nearly 19 to 20 trillion in GDP. We're almost twice as large as the second largest economy in the world, and that's China, which is at 10 or 11. The remaining nations are 7 and 6 and 5. We have an enormity of output in a great nation like ours. With all of this enormity of wealth and output and economic success, how can we leave anyone unfed, ill-clothed, or ill-housed? And that's a fundamental thing for me about our economy, and it's a fundamental issue about our, if you will, our values. And I think when you wrap it all together, the idea is, what should be our goal as a society? Should our goal to ensure that every family, every citizen, every child has a quality of life that is decent, dignified, and respectful? And in these discussions about economic policy, we get lost in what the North Star is. What is the North Star? What should we be striving for? And I think what we should be striving for is a society, from an economic standpoint, that provides, ensures, and yes, guarantees a certain standard of living to every citizen, every person, every child, every family, every senior.
Mark, we're in the middle of a pandemic. We're in the middle of an economic crisis, but we're also in the middle of a racial reckoning.
Yes.
What are the links between racial justice and economic justice, between structural racism and pervasive poverty in the United States?
So it's an important question, and we could devote a long time on that. Let me try to create a few basics. So when it comes to poverty in the United States today, the poverty rate amongst Black families is 2 to 3 times higher than the poverty rate amongst white families. When it comes to essentials like a job, historically, the unemployment rate or the jobless rate among Black people is twice that of white Americans. When you look at a fundamental like home ownership rates for white Americans is in the high 60s. For Black Americans, it is in the low 40s. So all the economic indicators demonstrate that there is a differential and there's a disparate. This has its history in both explicit and implicit, if you will, racially motivated policies. And so there's a strong intersection that poverty, as cruel as it is more severe among Black Americans, more severe among brown Americans. Being ill-housed, as severe as it can be, is more burdensome to more Black Americans in a sense of being proportionate to the population than white Americans. So I always say we've got to contextualize that there are more poor Americans in the United States than there are poor white Americans and poor Black Americans, but the percentage of Black people who are poor greatly exceeds that of white Americans. So there's a strong intersection. We could talk a long time about why Black people were denied home loans, business loans, car loans, denied access to jobs, denied access to many of the better neighborhoods historically, and until the revolution of the 1960s, which began to thaw that out. We were facing that, and we continue to face it today. I don't. People?
You've written a book with a great title, The Gumbo Coalition, calling for people and leaders from different places and backgrounds to come together to make change, make a better democracy. What do you think are the policies, the priorities, the kind of leadership that can bring us together to overcome poverty in a nation that is really divided politically, racially, economically, and ideologically? How do we build a gumbo coalition to overcome poverty?
I cut my teeth in local and state politics. I cut my teeth at the neighborhood, grassroots, and city level. And at that level, I think there's sometimes a better opportunity to find common ground, areas of to work together than perhaps in national politics, which is exceedingly partisan, very defined by political affiliation and ideological affiliation. That's not to say it doesn't exist at the state and local level, but I think sometimes there's a chance to find common ground with your neighbors. Again, John, I think identification of North Stars is really important. I think people have to get to a fundamental, what are we trying to accomplish and achieve? Now, I've always believed in the theory of the growing pie. And if we grow the pie, we can create more equity because we can create a larger slice for those who've historically been denied. If people believe in a zero-sum game society, that every time someone else gets something, I lose, or when you win, I lose, when I win, you lose. If that's your approach, but that's inconsistent with history. So I feel that leaders have to try as hard as they can to try to educate and find common ground, understanding, and I say this in my book, you may not achieve it. And if you don't achieve it, you've got to do what you got to do.
What a rich conversation. We have a ton of questions, and I'm going to just throw a couple of them out and let me know who's willing.
John, can I just say one thing that I want to completely agree with Mark on? I completely agree that there's a greater opportunity for working together in common ground at the local level than there is at the national level. It's apparent every day, and it was apparent to me in New York City and New York State, where I worked also at the local level. A lot of progress can and does happen there. The farther away from Washington, the better.
Well, Friday night, they passed a huge piece of legislation with a complete partisan divide. So that we got to overcome some of that. Let me throw three things out there. What does the vaccine policy and the different ways different groups are participating? What about the minimum wage? And what about forgiving college loans? What do those three things tell us about poverty, or how could they help us overcome poverty? Who wants to weigh in on what? Mark?
I'll take the minimum wage by simply saying that I think the minimum wage is one of those fundamental things that is about economic policy, but it's also about values. And I think it's instructive that since Congress has drug its feet, failed to find the votes necessary to increase the minimum wage since 2007, that there have almost been 30 states, I'm not sure the exact number, who have on their own increased the minimum wage. And those are blue states, red states, north states, south states, across the board. Well, anyone will tell you that's not the best economic policy, to have differential minimum wages, particularly for companies that do business across state lines, that a single minimum wage, which was the policy in this country for many, many years, is the way. I think of it this way. I think we ought to be incentivizing work. And I think work is incentivized when people know that if I put in 40 hours a week, if you put in 40 hours a week at the existing minimum wage, you're going to be making $30,000 a year. You're essentially going to be in poverty, working but in poverty. Maybe you can go get some benefit programs, but that's not guaranteed. There's no guaranteed you're going to get a Section 8, no guaranteed you're going to get any benefit programs. So I really feel that, once again, this minimum wage is not simply about economic policy. It's also about values. If the minimum wage had kept pace with inflation since 1968, it would be at $19 an hour. Just an indication on how the spending power of many Americans, and it's not just minimum wage Americans, it's working and middle class Americans, has eroded in the last 20 years.
Okay. Maria, let me put you on the spot maybe. You're dean of the McCourt School. We both work at Georgetown. Proud to be a part of the oldest Jesuit institution in the United States. Lots of our students are going to have lots of loans, and I bet they would like some help with those. What's your take on the loan forgiveness priority? Is it an important priority in terms of overcoming poverty and economic justice? Or are there other things we ought to focus on?
So, John, I would say that making education accessible to people is a critical piece of the puzzle. And I think the best way to do that is another question. And I will say that I'm not up on the specifics of the current policies for loan forgiveness. I think the challenge is to put people in a position where they can go and get the skills that they need without regard to what their family background is and what their current financial situation is. And we're clearly not in that place right now. And there's a lot more that we could do to improve that situation. Can I take crack at the COVID question, which is just to say, one of the things that I think is really interesting about COVID is that physiologically, it doesn't discriminate, generally speaking, by race and ethnicity. And yet we've seen extraordinarily different rates of both infection and of mortality across communities. And I think it gives us a really clear sense of how much work we have to do before we really are in a situation where we can have equality of opportunity. And that raises a whole set of issues for the distribution of the vaccine. And I think it's been, I guess, a challenge to watch in the absence, even though I agree with what both Mark and Robert said about there being opportunities to work together at the local level. I would also say that there are critical places for the federal government to establish basic standards, and the distribution of the vaccine was something that, and the kind of response to COVID in general, was a place where we really needed a much more competent and robust federal response. And our inability to do that, I believe, accounts for an important part of why we are so far behind other people as a country.
It seems to me that this is a classic example of the need for solidarity and the failure of subsidiarity. I mean, we've got to treat each other as members of one family, and then we got to figure out how to divide up the work. Lorena, can you talk about the experience of how COVID is touching people's lives and how the vaccine is finding a way into low-income communities like those you work with?
So for us in my neighborhood, the infection has been of the roof, right? Like the Latino community, low-income community, 3 out of 10 people are positive here. And we actually partner up with the UCSF, the university here, to do a study. So we door knocked everybody in the blocks and make sure everybody got tested pretty early on, just to show with data, because people need data. We already knew it in the neighborhood, but we needed to show that it was true, that the people who were the most infected were also the poorest people who have to live 4 or 5 families in one apartment, because the kind of rental costs that we have here makes us all live really piled up together. And it was the people that were most infected, in fact, were Latinos, were the folks that were living in overcrowded situations, were the folks that were quote unquote, like the new found essential workers. And they were the people that were most affected by this. And So our response, again, like working with government, informing government of what their steps should be, with our own wisdom that we have in our communities, was the fact that we needed to do testing sites in the communities run by the community, with the priorities that we set, and that we were doing the outreach for people to get tested, but not just to get tested, but also this idea that you have to test to care. Because what we were seeing is that people didn't want to get tested, because if you get tested, you can't work, you get kicked out of your apartment, because nobody wants, people want you out because you're going to get everybody sick. And so we fought to actually pass subsidies so that if somebody is positive, there's a whole program that will take food, PPE, and give people $1,280 so people could actually do the quarantine either in their home or in a hotel or whatever. But otherwise, people didn't want to get tested, and the infection was just off the roof. Everywhere else in our city, it was down. So it mirrors what's happening in the country. And like, if we're really serious about keeping people healthy, then we need to root the solutions in the community again. Talking about like, we know what's up. So, and finally, like now with the vaccines, we're also doing vaccination sites in our communities run by the community, because our people are scared of going and getting tested because of the history of medicine and experimentation with people of color. So messengers matter. So that's been the experience, and up to now is working. And it is a dialogue with government that's informed by the wisdom of the people in the communities. That's been working pretty well for us.
Robert, we have a number of questions that deal with morality, humanity, and Catholic social teaching. Lorena talked about the Pope, Mark talked about the New Testament, you talked about human flourishing, Maria offered us a moral challenge. What is the moral dimension of this? One person said, it was Andrew Mann, says we don't see the humanity of each other. And secondly, in the principles of Catholic social teaching, could we find a way forward that could bring people together? So morality, seeing each other in terms of our humanity, and then what are the moral principles that could guide our solution? And I'll begin with Robert, but anybody can weigh in.
Well, first, I'd just like to say that I've spent my career trying to get the resources of the government to be focused on low-income populations and struggling populations. And a broad-based forgiveness of loan forgiveness for colleges would, in my judgment, be a misuse of dollars at the federal level that could be better used, targeted to people who are in need. I think President Biden got it right when he said he would not do that. And I think that was because he knew it would be not very well targeted aid to struggling Americans. On the minimum wage, I have to say the labor markets in the United States are different. We are a big country, we have different labor markets. And I'd be very concerned with an overly high minimum wage that the Congressional Budget Office has shown now twice would reduce employment in low-income communities. And employment matters. And so I think minimum wage policies existed. It's existed at the state level, it's existed at the federal level. It may be too low, but $15 is probably too high if we're trying to help people who struggle the most. I am not very good on the big morality questions, John. I'm just a former government official who did his best to help struggling New Yorkers. While I attend Mass, I have sometimes been concerned at the extent to which the church is not as active in this field as it should be. So what I look to are the admonitions to care for the least fortunate, the least among us, and to look out for them, but look out for them in a way that will help them prosper and move up and lead flourishing lives, not just lives that are materially better, but that are spiritually and are better in a way in which they connect with other humans. And I think we can do that. I think we have done it, but we've got a lot of work left to do.
I suspect people may want to weigh in on the minimum wage comment, but I also want to talk about what are the moral principles drawn from our faith or otherwise that ought to guide our response.
Let me offer, this. I mean, I think I've seen the established church, the established Catholic Church in the country drift to a alignment of what I call intolerance, and away from the fundamentals around Catholic social teaching, the primacy of the New Testament, the gospel of Jesus Christ, the teachings and the parables, and somehow an embrace of this sort of rigidity around a whole host of issues that has pushed many people away from the established church, not away from the faith, away from the church. Central to all faith is caring about others, the humanity of people, the primacy of the human being in the order of being in this planet that we inhabit, and that all things should be about protecting the dignity and the quality of life. And I think that's so important. I don't want to get into a big debate on the minimum wage, but every one of those congressional analyses, none of them have used what I call the dynamism of how increases in the minimum wage would stimulate consumer spending, which is 75% of the 75% of the economy is being driven. So a lot of those analyses to me, and I think this is generally true for a lot of these Congressional Budget Office analysis, I think they're static. I don't think they really fully capture the impact and the effect. They're not designed to do that. But for those of us who are in favor of these issues, we have to challenge sometimes these reports.
I want to just weigh in a little bit. I'm supposed to be moderator, but I want to defend a little bit the church. It seems to me it's not only the church that is sometimes preoccupied with certain issues of enormous controversy and importance, abortion being one of them. I'm of the view that if we did a better job providing assistance to moms and their kids, we'd have fewer abortions, and we could talk about that. But day to day, the Bishops' Conference is working to increase the minimum wage, played a crucial role in getting the refundability of the children's tax credit and the ITC in there. And frankly, I don't know any other institution in the country that will do more this evening to shelter the homeless, feed the hungry, educate kids in our schools, and reach out to people in need. So there might be, we've always had a PR problem. There might be a priority problem, but I think our community is trying to live out the gospel, and we can always do better. Enough, that's my commercial. Maria or Lorena want to weigh in on the principles that ought to guide us, and then we'll go on to another question.
Well, I will, Lorraine and I are each trying to be polite and let the other one go first, but I will weigh in, but I will do so as an economist more than to weigh in on the church's teachings, which is to say that I really feel like we need to think carefully about where that we are often what I would call penny wise and pound foolish. So I was really struck when Robert compares things that will support people in the short run versus kind of the benefits of, if it would be the kind of discipline of work. You didn't use that phrase, Robert, but that was part of, I think, what you and I have talked about in the past. And I think what we know is that if we invest in children and families, if we give everyone access to the resources to succeed, if children and families have good choices, and an adequate safety net when they're faced with bad luck or mistaken judgment, then we will reap the benefits as a country. More success in school and higher productivity and less crime and fewer family challenges and illness. So I really reject this idea that we can either help people in the short run, but that'll be their undoing in the long run. I think we have pretty strong research that suggests that children do better in school when they're not hungry, that parents are less likely to neglect their children when they have more income support, that disadvantaged workers are more likely to work when they earn a living wage. And I think if the only way to get people to get enough jobs is to pay them a wage that is so low that they can't support their families, then we need to recognize that we have a problem at the systemic level with the availability of family supporting jobs, and not put wages so low that families can't thrive at those. And then we end up blaming the individual people as opposed to the system.
I would just like to respond. I was only saying that we shouldn't make big transformative changes to our safety net with the overmath of an emergency. That I think we need to be careful about making significant, big, long-term changes without thinking them through carefully. I don't think there's a conflict between doing things now and also doing things later.
Sure.
And I didn't say that, and I didn't imply that.
Okay, and I would just say that.
Question of Robert. Somebody asked, the Biden proposal is a one-year proposal. What would be the possibility of enacting that? It looks like it's going to be enacted, and then take a look at its impact on the quality of people's lives, their choices, their connection to work, and then learn from that for the future.
Well, you're right. The Biden proposal is currently limited to 1 year. The intention is to then build it into the future years in future legislation. I think a better way to look at it would be to test it in a state or local place and see how that works before making it national policy. Once a policy of this kind gets in and the benefits are so generous, it becomes hard to get out, at least in the short term. And I don't think we'll have enough time to know. I mean, I would ask Maria. I mean, there certainly we'll learn something. When do we think we will get back to child poverty levels as they were in 2019? Will it be next year? Will it be the year after that? Will we have to wait till 2024? I want it as soon as possible.
Okay.
And I have a worry that it won't happen as soon as possible if we don't focus a little more on employment and less on benefit transfer.
Okay, Maria, I'll give you a shot at that. We're approaching the end of our time. I have two questions, one general and one specific. It seems to me we have an agreement on the priority of overcoming poverty and lift people up on the bottom. We have some differences on the ways to go about that, and we've had a pretty vigorous discussion on that. What will it take to get our country to focus on this and to make the investments necessary? How do we move from a status quo where this has been sort of in the rhetoric of public life and not in the reality of public life? And then there are a couple thousand people on this Zoom call. What could each of us do? If there was one thing we could do in the next week, not in terms of reaching out to our neighbor, I think we're all trying to do that, but in terms of shaping a country that treats the least of these better, what could we do? So in general, what will it take to make this a priority for the coming year or 2 years? And secondly, what could each of us do? And let me begin with Maria, because I think you might want to make a comment on what Bob said.
Of course.
Well, I will just say that I find it challenging to understand why an expanded child tax credit would not be an effective way to reduce poverty. And because it doesn't get pulled back when people are employed, you have to believe in an extraordinarily large negative impact on people's employment to think that it won't improve poverty. So I just don't think that's credible. So I don't share Robert's concern on that. And I would say that I wouldn't think that the expansion of the child tax credit is something that we just thought of yesterday and we're imposing it in this kind of unthoughtful way. As John suggested, it's something that's been on a lot of people's agenda as the work that your institution, Robert, and others have done. It's part of an evolution of policy, and I think it's an evolution in a really good direction. The current policy just doesn't help the people that need the help the most as much as it should. On the more general question you asked, John, I guess what I would say is that the disproportionate impact of COVID on the least advantaged of us, and especially on communities of color, is a really clear sign of how much work we need to do to deliver on the promise of equal opportunity. The disproportionate vulnerability of children, for me, is a sign of what really constitutes an irresponsible failure to invest in the next generation. And that is a failure to protect our collective future. And maybe it's because I'm an economist that I tend to kind of rely on focusing both on what we ought to do, but then also what's in our self-interest. And what I would say is both what we ought to do and what is in our self-interest is to provide appropriately for the people at the bottom, especially the kids.
Lorena, you let us off with an incredible eloquence about your own community, and then in the middle about your own experience. How do we make this a priority? How does the dignity of the people you work with become front and center of our national discussion? And then what should each of us do?
So Pope Francis, he said that the pandemic shed light on the risk and consequences inherent in a way of life dominated by selfishness and a culture of waste. And he set before us a choice, either to continue on the road we have followed until now, or to set out a new path. That to me is, again, like at the root of the question. It's not so much about what to do, but also what we want to become and how we make those choices. That matters. And who do we love when we're making those choices as a country, as a government, as in the city, in the county, in the state, in the nation, and it matters. And I understand that there's a whole set of things that people have to consider, but at the end of the day, it boils down to what happened to our children, what happened to our elders, and what happens to the people in the margin and the most vulnerable. So my suggestion is, as Pope Francis said, we have to start, if we want to change things, we have to start by thinking about the margins as that being the center. So what about the most vulnerable? What about the people in the margin? Making them a priority will lift up the whole country. And in terms of what we need to do as people, as individuals, I think that, again, it's a question for each of us. Who do we want to become during the time of a global pandemic? What is your gift? What is it that you're going to offer right now to your community in whatever aspect of life you are protagonist in? So that's a question for each person, but the answer is not just to sit in your home. So we need to be able to tell a story to our children about this time.
A great final comment. Tell the story. Robert, quick comment. What do each of us need to do?
Well, I would like to first by talking about the priority item. I actually disagree a little bit with you, John, about it not being a national priority. I think the history of America shows that this has been something that we focused on year after year after year. The expenditures are quite large and have grown year after year after year. We may not be succeeding, but all of us on this call, and maybe many of the people listening, have devoted our lives to it, and we're not alone. So I think you're a little too tough on the American heart. I think the American heart is bigger than you give it credit for and has made a lot of progress in helping struggling Americans. And I would say that in compared to any other country in the world. So I want to say that first. I want to make it more of a priority. I think it should be a bigger priority, but we don't want to forget that we've made some progress. I think the big thing we can do now, I used to always say that, and I used to interpret this question as what can you do in your own life? And I always would say, based on what my experience is, read to a third grader in a school that needs additional volunteers, because that's a really concrete thing you can do. Right now, given the school circumstances, that's still going to be really important because there's been a lot of lost learning, especially in poor school districts. But right now, I'm very concerned about small employers who are really been devastated by this in retail and restaurants and the people that work there. Those businesses need to come back. And I think we should be thinking about them, because I have to say, it's that collection of employers, of people who have some education or a lot of education, who really do provide opportunity for Americans, and we shouldn't forget them.
I remember on our first COVID discussion, we had the owner of a little Central American restaurant who made that. Mark, bring us home. You have put racial justice at the center of the anti-poverty struggle. How do we make it a priority? What should we do?
We have to understand that these two issues are interdependent. The struggle against poverty and the struggle for racial justice, they intersect, they're intertwined, they're interconnected. And as we understand that, being intentional from a racial standpoint about many of our policies will yield the kind of changes we want. Now, I'll put this in probably the broader context that I think about, and that is the arc of the last 35 to 40 years economically in this country, where what we've seen is an erosion of the earning power of, I'll say, the bottom 70% of Americans, where that earning, what they bring in because of their work, has not kept pace with inflation. I think this is one of the great risks for the future of the American economy. The, if you will, redistribution of wealth upward in the economy, which is quite distinct from what happened in the post-World War II to the 1980s period, which created this middle class. And I think what we have to do is create a new middle class in America. And I think our policies have to be aligned. I think our trade policies, our tax policies. And the final thing I'll say, I was not amazed, but 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, the Congress passed a $1.5 trillion big tax cut. And here we are, mired in the mud in a discussion over a child care tax credit of $3,500 per family per year. I mean, something's wrong with our values when a major tax cut of $1.5 trillion could sail through, and something for working families gets excessively analyzed, chopped into bits, and re-examined. I mean, sometimes we got to ask, what are our priorities and what is our North Star?
I want to thank you all for a lively, focused discussion. I had a great closing about the importance of Catholic social thought, and I'm not going to give it except to say that the most important word in Catholic social teaching is the word "and." Human life and dignity, human rights and responsibility, the priority of the poor and the common good, solidarity and subsidiarity. And there ought to be a way to pull ourselves together to make a big difference here. I want to give you a preview of coming attractions on March 11th. We're going to have one of our Salt and Light gatherings for Catholics under 40, talking about young Catholics and the Biden administration. We're working on our annual Francis Factor dialogue, which should be really exciting. Pope Benedict said today there's only one Pope, and it's Francis, which is apparently news to some people. And then we're working on a dialogue on pluralism and religious liberty and the common good, which should be really interesting. I want to thank all those who joined us. I want to thank our co-sponsor, the McCourt School. I want to thank the Rockefeller Fund and the Democracy Fund. I want to thank our colleagues in the Better Politics Consortium around the country. I want to thank my colleagues, Kim and Anna, but I especially want to thank Robert, Maria, Lorena, and Mark for a terrific conversation, lifting up, I think, what is at the center of who we are as a nation. Thank you very much.